Here we go.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our series of presentations designed to help Kansas companies expand their exports. Today, we'll focus on a subject that certainly needs greater clarification right now: Kansas exports and the conflict in Ukraine. My name is Jeff Willis, and I am the director of the International Division here at the Kansas Department of Commerce. I'll be your MC for today's event. This session will be recorded and will be accessible via our website once it has been posted. We look forward to any questions you may have, so please don't hesitate to post them at any time in the chat box. Towards the end of the program, we'll go over your questions and hopefully have some good answers for you. Given today's subject matter and the expertise we have before you, please plan on this webinar to run the full hour. So don't hesitate to pose your questions. For our speaker today, we are particularly fortunate to have Lesa Brownell. Lesa is a Global Center of Excellence Compliance Manager at TVH Parts Co. Americas Region, as well as a certified U.S. Export Compliance Officer. Lesa is a popular speaker for the International Division and knows her stuff. Last year, she co-hosted 2 webinars about supply chain disruption. In fact, for more than 30 years, Lesa Brownell has been working in compliance and international trade in various industries worldwide. She is recognized for her knowledge and experience in risk management, investigative reporting, and development of policy implementation to comply with laws and regulations. Lesa has worked with international businesses developing policies that comply with organizational regulatory requirements, and she's worked with a multitude of organizations, both large and small. In addition, Lesa directs reviews of state and federal regulatory compliance requirements to include analysis of business impact, operational risk assessment for enacted laws and regulations, and recommended company compliance actions to ensure regulatory compliance. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to pass the platform over to Lesa. Lesa?
Thank you, Jeff. Today, as Jeff said, this is an ever-changing topic. Regulations and news and information is daily. I am going to ask to excuse my voice. I'll try to speak as clearly as I can. You know, it is a season for allergies, I think. And so, next slide. We actually are going to go over, if we could go to the next slide, thanks. There we go, awesome. So today, you know, the developments in Russia, Ukraine, the crisis, the Belarus, you know, they do have an impact on companies around the world, not just in Kansas, but, you know, if you're a company that's a global company, people that are exporting and what's been done. Today, in this webinar, my focus is really more on just kind of a quick overview of what those sanctions are, but understanding how those sanctions could affect your company's day-to-day operations, some pinpoints on just some key compliance considerations, challenges, things that you can consider and think about for policies as you evaluate your own company's risk. Talk about some global sanction considerations that may have an impact on your business locally, but also globally. And then tips for reviewing your current existing compliance policies. What you can do to mitigate, you know, in things you might not have otherwise considered. And certainly I, you know, always appreciate everyone's feedback. Every company is completely different. And so the risk to you is going to be completely different as compared to somebody else. So approaching this from a, you know, just a broader perspective. Next slide. So OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, their mission, we all understand it is to accomplish foreign policy and national security goals, right? And that's why they impose the sanction regulations. They use those as a tool. And so the rate, what I thought was interesting, you know, just the comments, and we see a lot of those that are being made where they're talking about the latest Russian sanctions. They do make it very clear. Well, we're not at war, right? In a traditional sense, the US is using the economic weapons against Putin, right? And so there's a clear, distinct difference because we hear a lot about embargoes, we hear a lot about trade restrictions, and there's a significant difference with sanctions. And so the risk is even higher now, right, with the changes and everything that are coming in. So next slide. This is just kind of a quick overview of some, you know, it started early on with the financial sanctions, and that's where OFAC started. And, you know, a lot, the DNR comprehensive sanctions on the executive order, the VE banks and all their 25 subsidiaries, The goal was to try to cut off the money, to try to cut off all of the transactions that were going back and forth. PSB Bank and 17 of its subsidiaries on the SDN list, but then they also brought in understanding subject to the 50% rule. And here's where a lot of companies really need to pay close consideration. How many companies are really screening the company in what we call a business owner, right? And so do you screen your banks and who you do business with? Are you screening the business owner and their ownership? So Russia's expands very deep. And so their ownership into these banks, their ownership into companies, and digging deeper into where they have investments. This is a huge impact when we're looking at the SDN list and also items that are subject to the 50% rule. And so on the next slide, again, it's just more sanctions that we're talking about. Next slide. The Serbia Bank and 25 of its subsidiaries, the Gazprom and 12 others were added. Many of the VTB banks, you've got the Sovcom, and I will apologize right now if I mispronounce something. It is not intended. There's some names out here. So many of these banks, it's just a large amount of banks. And so what happened is the banks came in and a lot of the regulations were March 22nd, March 23rd, March 25th, but the banks started early. They're like, nope, we're done. Let's stop it right here, right? And so as you can see, a lot of these banks that are added to the SDN list are also subject to the 50% rule, which it gets into your companies and who they own and the ownership in some of the banks as well. So on the next slide is another list of banks as well. Excuse me. So numerous independents and their relatives added to the SDN list. The US and the EU and France, Germany, Italy, UK, Canada, they all agreed on the sanctions against Russia and the central bank of Russia. There was a huge movement also to remove certain Russian banks from SWIFT, which is a method in which that is used to pay for, it's when you do wire transfers, and SWIFT is used to do a authentication, right? Even in letter of credits when payments are made. So there's just dozens of general licenses that we're trying to attack the banks, the finance, and to block those, right? And so in the next slide is some of the recent activities that happened where Department of Justice, they launched a new task force called the Klepto Capture, and it's an intelligence law, right? It's an enforcement task that was dedicated to enforcing the huge amount of sanctions that were coming out and the export restrictions and trying to put some countermeasures in that the U.S. has imposed while we're trying to partner with other allies to do something similar and the same. And so they've identified blocked properties and sanctions against Russia. So on the next slide, we also talk about investments, right? Where huge block on new investments in the energy sector with the Russian Foundation. So any goods, any products that are manufactured, extracted, or processed in Russian Federation, right? The origin of those goods that has been incorporated or substantially transformed from a foreign-made product also has an impact as well. And so any transaction that is constituting that commitment for those funds, the assistance, the loans, the assets, the credit to a new energy sector activity, blocked, stop, right? So they're trying to cut off as much as they possibly can with investments. And so on the next slide, you'll see what are companies doing? What did they do to actually take it farther, right? And so this is where we saw businesses speak up. This is where they started to take an ethical stance and just realize, whoa, what is going on here, right? Banks, as I mentioned earlier, banks stopped the transfer of funds with certain, with Russian banks prior to the effective date. Shell said that it would back off from joint ventures for projects in countries and quit in the role of financing. And so the now halted Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, BP said that they were exiting its 20% stake that they had in Russian oil producers, the Rosneft, right? And then you have Equinor, which is your Norway's oil and gas companies. They withdrew from joint ventures in Russia and stopped new investments. All of this happened right when just within a week, right? Just very near time, all of the invasion happened. And this was long before all the sanctions that we have today and everything that was happening. Companies were speaking up. And you've got Daimler Truck Holding, who stopped sending components to its Russian joint ventures partner, and Volvo Cars said that it's going to halt business in Russia, right? MIT, they announced that it was ending its relationship with private graduate students for universities in Russia that they actually helped to establish about a decade ago following the invasion of Ukraine. And so Dell suspended product sales in Russia, joining a growing number of large Western companies who are reevaluating their business. They're looking at responses in the country invasion in Russia. And so Russia had kicked out, Russia themselves was actually kicked out of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar by FIFA. So you can hear and you can see these are just a few small examples of some of the companies who actually spoke up and took these things further, right? And so some of the latest things that happened on the next slide, you'll see where there's new cybersecurity controls, because the next thing was a cyber attack, right? And so the US government, BIS, stood up and they said, whoa, let's restrict those certain items that could have malicious cyber activities by imposing licensing requirements, including China and Russia, right? So your export control classification number, your ECCNs of your 4A005, your 4D software, your 4E technology, right? These components. But think for a moment, when you have cybersecurity controls, do you have offices in Russia? Does your cybersecurity located in Russia? Where's your data center located? Do you ever have a need for companies who work in your IT department and you need to export laptops to them? What kind of software is on there? What kind of work is it they're actually doing? Where are they located? What is their citizenship? These are all things that you need to consider, because a lot of cybersecurity controls, a lot of big name companies that manage data centers and IT resources is in Russia, is in Serbia, is in India, a lot of these other different areas in these countries, right? And so it just kept growing and it didn't stop there, right? So Russia, on the next slide, you'll see Russia retaliated, and they came back and they shut its airspace to 36 countries in retaliation against our sanctions, right? Well, this is a huge hit, and they knew this, right? Because Russia had prohibited over 36 airlines from 36 countries, including 27 of the EU nations. And so this move is a substantial impact into companies in Europe who export to Asia, right? And so on the next slide, you'll see where that impact is around the air freight, the ocean freight, your road transportation that happens. All flights to and from Ukraine, they're suspended, right? Most of our flights to and from Russia, the EU has banned all Russian-owned and Russian-controlled aircrafts entering into EU airspace. Many airlines will avoid Russian airspace by taking more of a southern route. Well, what does that do? If I'm taking now a more southern route, now I've got a longer time to get there, more cost in fuel, because they're trying to avoid Russian airspace. So those flights, when you would normally fly across Russia to get there, was a quick way to go through, but now you're going over Russian territory. Now you can't. Now you have to circle around, right? So all the floating cargo initially bonded for Ukraine is now being redirected to neighboring ports in Romania, Lebanon, and Greece. And so there is an expectation that it is very plausible that the same sanctions that are on the air freight are going to happen on the vessels as well. Road transportation, all the borders to and from Ukraine remain closed, with the exception, of course, for aid relief and any government defense contractors. So Russian borders are still open as of the time I wrote this. So there's changes daily, right? So just make note of that. Many transporters have they've actually ceased. So even if you wanted to still do business in Russia and your products are not controlled, your products don't go to a military end user, your products are, not in any control list, you've cleared the flags for all of the entity of who that it's actually going to, but did you really, right? Now you have the challenge of how am I even going to get there? Because the transportation, these companies are ceasing operations into and from Russia. They're not even crossing the borders because of everything that's going on. And so on the next slide, you'll see this is just kind of a overview where it just talks about airlines from the EU and that go over into Asia. So CNN had actually reported in March 20th, they had talked about the closure of the Russian airspace for international carriers. Finnair's flight from Helsinki to Tokyo, as an example, literally it was it was about 5,000 miles to go across because they went across Russia, and it took about 8 hours to get there to Tokyo. Today, now they have to go all the way up to the northern, straight north, heading to the Norwegian territory, and then before crossing over the North Pole in Alaska, to even go straight down through the Pacific to get to Narita, right, into Japan. So now that's 40% more fuel costs. That is 8,000 miles and 13 hours in transportation to get there. So a huge significant impact, right? Not only in just the transportation side, but if you thought about trying to do business in Russia, right, you have ethical considerations to consider because some of these big businesses have pulled out. You have really strong, stringent controls that you really have to make sure that, whoever you're screening and whoever it is you're doing business with, are you actually looking to make sure, are you screening the business owner, or are you just screening the company, right? And so on the next slide, we talk a little about some of those key compliance considerations and some of those challenges, right? So as I mentioned, even if your company doesn't sell military devices, can you be assured that your products will not be used for military application? Again, they might not be on a control list, right? But even BIS is even starting to have even more stricter controls, even on items that are not on a control list, right? Because this all goes into military end use. But again, screening your banks. Who owns the bank? So it's not just the bank itself, but who owns that bank? Because now we're getting into the 50% rule, as well as who owns the company, right? So I mentioned earlier on your cybersecurity, we talked about who manages your IT data center, right? So a lot of companies are using cloud sourcing. Do we have citizens, Russian citizens, who actually have access to your technology? Well, first of all, let's hope that it's not in the cloud, right? And you are actually controlling that anyway. But a lot of companies who have offices in Russia, they are relocating employees to another location. But the restrictions in Russia have even gone even more severe, in which that Russia is telling businesses, if you pack up and leave this country, we own all of your assets. You forfeit it all and we own it, right? So careful and cognizant of some of that, where, if you have offices in Russia and you decide to relocate some of those employees, do they have access to your networks, right? So EU had actually made more stronger, stringent controls when they first started blocking items on the as dual use controlled. Before the US did. US has now got more stringent controls as well. And those shipments were even being blocked. And it didn't matter whether you said that item was on the control list or not. Customs in the EU was actually blocking items because there was purported to be, based on the tariff classification of the item, that said this possibly was interchangeable with military vehicles, or it possibly could be used in energy. And you had to prove otherwise, right? But when you sell, so when you export from here in the US, does your inventory have goods prior to all this ever happening that has a country of origin of Russia? Because guess what? Countries are now coming in and they are tariffing an additional tariff of 35% on top of your duties and taxes. So if you ship something to Canada, 35% tariff if the country of origin is Russia, right? And so these are things, right? Looking at your inventory, looking at your country of origin of goods that you have, just because of your landed cost is already adjusted based on your tariffs of what that you have. But now we have these new sanctions, we have these new enforcement measures that are being imposed, and we need to take a look at, additional impact that your landed cost may not necessarily adjust as well. Okay. So globally, right, on the next slide, we'll talk about some global sanction considerations, right? So a lot of other countries are joining forces together with the US, and that's exactly what needed to happen. We needed not the US to be alone in all of this. We needed other countries to partner with us and join in. And so on the next slide, you'll see what other countries are doing. We're in Asia, right? From Japan to Singapore and Korea and Taiwan, they agreed to implement export controls. Taiwan just released this week more stringent controls on technology, on the energy sector, on things of potential military application and control licensing requirements. Japan, they agreed to remove Russian banks from SWIFT. Huge impact because not only did Russia, the world's largest economy, freeze Moscow's access to tens of billions of dollars worth of currency reserves held into the central bank of Tokyo, it also joined the group, right, of the 7 nations in Australia to cut some of Russian banks off from the global interbank messaging system known as SWIFT. And so that was a huge impact and a huge win, right, for all of us together, where we are freezing the assets. And so when you're considering some of these things that are going on globally, if you have offices in other locations, it's not just US law that you have to consider, right? You have to also look at some of the other countries' laws as well. What are their sanctions? What have they done? What are their export controls? Because I can tell you they're not all the same today. Will they eventually align? Let's hope so. But they're all changing daily for everything that's happening. Canada closed off its airspace to all Russian aircraft. They canceled export permits for what were previously issued for exports to Russia. They issued sanctions as well. But again, as I mentioned, goods that are imported into Canada with a country of origin Russia are subject to 35% tariff. And it's not necessarily that the goods are actually coming from Russia, it's simply because the country of origin of the goods are Russia, right? So do an inventory analysis, verify, look at your products. If you are a global company, you also want to look at the sanctions globally and not just within the United States, because you need to have an understanding of what some of these other countries are doing, because some countries have not all joined forces to do sanctions. And the last thing you want is for one of your countries that you have offices in, that they export to Russia, or that they are actually making exports to other locations that could cause a global impact and liability back to your company. And on the next slide, we talk a little bit more on EU sanctions. And as I mentioned earlier, their dual use regulations under Annex 1, those regulations were already previously restricted in the military sector, but they went further and they said if they are intended for civilian use or users, right, they block those as well. So again, Customs was already starting to block, and this was a month ago, and they already started to block items in advanced technology and things that were thought to be items for control. So if you export something to the US and then your EU offices and then they try to re-export it, remember, U.S. law is going to apply because it originally left the United States and now it's being re-exported. So know who your distributors are, what are they doing, know who your customers, who they do business with, right? And just issuing those sanctions, those restrictions, and just understanding the supply and the transfer of those items before they're actually any type of financial assistance or anything that's even happening. And so Europe has a huge impact on all of this as well. And so on the next slide, we talk about how Europe depends on the energy from Russia. The natural gas prices have already increased 20%, and this is 6 times higher than it was in the very beginning of 2021, where you have high gas prices that are feeding inflation, you have industries at natural gas, and all of this when we already had a challenge with COVID pandemic and the supply chain disruption. Now, even more, you have an even bigger disruption on supply chain disruption. So I don't know how many of you are following what's happening in Shanghai, but they're in lockdown again. Started with 9 days, and now so the port is closed, and so trying to get testing done because they have another outbreak of what they had lifted it April 1st, and then they went back again, and so it's causing major ports, major delays as well. So when cargo is being routed, freight forwarders now have to start to consider, if I'm leaving the EU to go somewhere into Asia, I don't want to be going through connection flights through Shanghai. I've got to keep going, right, to another port or to another location in how I'm rerouting. And what does that do? Increases our transportation cost even more because of the fuel costs and everything that's happening. So globally, on the next slide, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it is expected to affect the world trade heavily, right? In the very near future, among the outcomes, it's expected to increase, as we talked about, transportation and logistic costs, supply chain disruptions. They're just going to even go higher, and electricity prices. The exports of wheat and corn impact countries in South America because they actually buy this wheat in Russia and Ukraine for underdeveloped regions in South America, right? Russia and Ukraine together account for 1/4 of the world's wheat exports and 1/5 of the corn sales, right? You've got titanium that are used in airplanes. This is Russia and Ukraine, they supply 13% of the world's supply for this. Palladium, right, that's used in cars, it's used in cell phones, it's used in dental fillings. Russia and Ukraine, they supply 30% of that, right? So these are all things now that are going to look at the supply chain that we need to look at, the sourcing of those. But again, remember, as you're starting to look at, if you use some of these products and the raw materials of what's used in part of your requirements, you have that shift to go to other suppliers. Well, that shift, right, we're looking at other supply chain, and now are they going to be able to meet capacity? So, international trade, India's trade relations with India, they're limited, but Russia and Belarus are the world's leading exporter of fertilizer, right? Which in Russia is India's leading supplier of arms. So very close watch on India right now, very close watch on China, major economy and most risk in Egypt, home to more than 100 million people, right, is the biggest buyer of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So significant, right? And as we start to look at this global impact, on the next slide, you see that this is an actual image that people, in Russia, they don't agree with it, right? But these are things we have to look at the whole picture. Not only your compliance processes, where your IT is, where your other offices are, where your distributors are doing business, but also your supply chain, right? Putin is not really showing any signs, that he's going to compromise and he's going to give up or end all of this, right? But the longer that this conflict continues, the greater the impact that we're actually going to see. Excuse me, I'm going to cough.
Hey, Lisa, you're still on mute.
There you go.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Awesome,
Yep,
thank
you're
you. Sorry, I had a cough. I didn't want to disrupt, so. So on the next slide, you know, I talk a lot about risk assessments when I'm doing webinars and stuff, because there's value in those, right? You can't know what your risk is until you start to conduct an assessment, right? If your business decides to exit the market, have you really exited the market, right? An example would be you have an office in Russia and you relocate those. In the EU, they have products that are controlled and cannot be exported to Russia. That's not just the export of the product. If you have technology associated with the design methodology and the building of a product that is also export controlled, wherever you relocate a Russian citizen, be cognizant and aware of that deemed export rule, right? To make sure that they're not gaining access to technology that is controlled. End user declarations, if you decide to still do business in Russia, in getting an end user declaration, how do you know that your company is, that the customer who's signing that is legitimate, in that they're telling you the truth? Because, and that they're not really being coerced by the Russian military, right? Just to gain access to your products, right? So Russia has hindered the US and our ability for years to conduct end-use checks. And so just being diligent and careful and cognizant about that. And again, talking about the technology, what access that they have to that, and then global offices inventory, right, in goods with a country of origin of Russia. Do an inventory analysis of all your offices, of all your different locations. Do they have a country of origin of Russia of those goods? Because now even though it was from before, you have this item in inventory, as I mentioned. If you export that item, now you're going to get hit with an additional tariff, because even in the US, they did not, the most favored nation, they did not apply. So even the US is hitting with a country of origin of 35% if it's Russia. So, and on the next slide, rules change daily, right? Not a lot of people have access to monitor this on a daily basis. I get that. There's a lot that's really going on, but it is your responsibility from a due diligence perspective to really monitor that, and to really know that being prudent for businesses, that if you are leaving Russia and you have offices there, or you've just decided to block, you know, any exports to Russia, that's your office. What about your other offices, right? Because it's really just going to only escalate from here, you know. But is someone reviewing your products against the Commerce Control List? Because these are changing constantly. If you are still considering doing business, this is a risk, right? Our distributors selling into Russia or Belarus. But again, if you are, how are you going to get paid? I mean, that's the big $1 million question, because the banks have cut off a lot of their reach is very significant, as you saw the many different banks, their subsidiaries. It'll be very, very difficult for you to even get paid in addition to the transportation. There's new foreign direct product rules. Do you have knowledge, or do you know that your products are being used in certain Russian and Belarusian entities, right? You have the OFAC 50% rule that prohibits transactions with entities that are owned by 50%. Again, how deep are you doing your screening of the company and of the banks that you are, you know, if you can do business with them. So again, the due diligence is on you. You want to evaluate any alternatives if you continue to move forward, determine the dependencies, looking at your supply chain, but also working with your freight forwarder on, you know, alternative routes, methods, understanding the cost impact, what that's going to be. If there's changes that are needed that are to, you know, your policy, you know, because obviously Russia is a sanctioned country now, but you know, those additional requirements, right, that are now needed should a business continue. But again, looking at your distributors, looking at your customers who are considering exports to another location. So if you have customer agreements and they talk about sanctioned countries, you want to make a special attention to Russia and Belarus, there might need to be changes, modifications. So just some things to consider, things to look at. And just open it up to any questions that anybody might have right now. That was a lot of information.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lesa. That was a lot of information. I'm still digesting it too. It's a good thing we have an expert like you who can address this for us, because I know it gets pretty arcane and very detailed very quickly. We do have a question here from one of the viewers in the chat room, and they're looking at transportation issues, and they were wondering whether or not it was still possible to assuming, of course, all of the other regulatory compliance, et cetera, issues are in play. Let's just talk straight transport. You know, can things be transported by road now, goods from the EU to Russia or to Belarus? You know, what do you know about land transportation of product into those countries?
So we talked about it a little bit already. Land transportation, nothing going in and out of Ukraine. And a lot of the carriers so the Ukraine borders are closed. The borders going into Russia, as I know it now, is open. But a lot of the carriers, the road transportation carriers, are ceasing operations. They're not actually crossing over the border into Russia, making it very difficult. Even the carriers are withdrawing. They're saying, nope, we're not taking it in.
Thank you. You know, we're going to range widely, I think, with the questions. There are a number of them at different levels. Some probably will get very specific. But just generally, what's the best source of information for a small and medium-sized company as they look to understand this rapidly changing landscape and make sure that they've got, you know, proper policies and procedures in place to be able to address it, let alone efforts to try to address any of the economic or cost implications of any adjustments they make? So what would you recommend as the best source or sources that might be able to help them navigate their way through that?
Yeah, so it's really plural of sources, right? If your transportation company has so, you know, there's a company that I sign up for lots of newsletters on, Notum Logistics. They're here in Kansas, and they actually provided the transportation side on the air, the ocean, and the road transportation updates and everything. They have very good dialogue and communication of what's happening in China, what's happening in Russia, what's happening from a freight handling perspective. So any freight forwarder that has a newsletter that provides updates, that is good source of information, because that's targeted to the transportation industry. But I also sign up. I receive constant newsletters from James Bartlett, also from Stars Law Firm. These different law firms put out blogs and newsletters. Vocavo Law Firm as well, they all have blogs. And so I get these news reels that come into my inbox, and those are things that I'm reviewing constantly to just look at, hey, what is my impact? And so where do you draw, you know, I don't think that anyone is really addressing anything specific to, hey, here's what you need to do to go change your compliance policy. What they are addressing is the regulatory changes, right? So your business needs to make a decision. Am I still going to export to Russia? And if you're not, then it's keeping up to date, you know, as a reference of what's going on. If you are, then now you need to understand, what are the laws? What are the restrictions? What can I or can I not? And these change daily.
Great. Well, thank you. You know, the thought occurred to me, and I feel badly for any company that may be in the position that I'm going to describe. But what about those companies that may have, let's say, a product in country already, either in Russia, Belarus, or potentially even Ukraine, and they're trying to execute payment for, are they basically, don't have an option available because of the way the banking system has been constrained, so that things will be okay. Well, then things will be in somewhat limbo, as it were. Their product or their goods are going to be in country. Is there any kind of a strategy you can talk about that might be able to address that? I mean, perhaps they had insured, insurance on what they had, et cetera. But I mean, can you describe a potential way to weather this challenge? And again, another question I'm going to follow up with later on has to do with any kind of prognostication you have as to what kind of a timeline we're looking at, given certain assumptions, of course, because there are unknowns right now that are pretty extreme, and it's uncertain really as to where things are going to go. But so let's start with the first one that looks at people that are companies that may have exposure already with goods in country, any of the implicated countries, and what do they just have to write that off, or what do you suggest? What's in play?
So if you have something in transit, I would say good luck getting it there, right? And I would highly recommend that you return it, or it gets lost in a shuffle of customs hold, because it could easily be lost within that zone area of what am I going to actually do with it. You're also at risk of seizure of your goods, depending on what type of item it is, because it's such a volatile area right now, part of the world, that a lot of people just don't want to keep doing business there. And it frankly really, and Wood from Desk Arts, which is formerly Visual Compliance, he said it really well. He says, companies need to figure out that we just don't want to continue to figure out a way to do business because the regulations keep changing so frequently. You could have something that goes in transit and all of a sudden now it's blocked, or you could have something that's going to get seized by customs depending on the route that it goes, through in transit to get there. And just being able to send it to a very volatile area, frankly, you just don't want to damage your image and your reputation of what could happen. Banks, it is very, very difficult for you to try to get paid from anyone there, right? If it is a government military, right, that's a little bit different, because now that you're doing it as an exception with a licensing requirement, and you're being paid by the US government, not by the Russian government, because if it's going to the Russian government, it's not happening. It'll be seized, right? So that's a tough question to answer, Jeff, because there's really not a good answer, from the sense that you really just need to pull out.
Yeah,
it's too difficult to get there.
I kind of thought that was going to be the answer, but I definitely wanted to at least put it out there so that people could hear you talk about it, because you do end up, of course, talking about some of the other aspects that they have to pay attention to when you answered it. But yeah, I mean, when we look at the kind of exposure that's in play right now that people have, and certainly it's an ongoing situation with regards to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the result of which is still unclear as it moves forward. It strikes me, and you've been in this business for a long time, I don't know how many war regions you've had to navigate through over time, but it certainly strikes me that we're talking about a disruption that is going to persist for probably years in some fashion. When you've got joint ventures being pulled down, you've got the threat of seizing of assets that are already in place. How do those questions become resolved? How does all that get addressed? Basically, you're looking at a circumstance where it's probably we're going to have to we'll pay attention to the day-on-day kind of changes, as you say, but they're not going to be radical shifts in what's happening, and rather you're going to see these kinds of restrictions in place, probably, or implications of these restrictions in place for probably years to come. What do you think about that? What's your prognostication?
I totally agree. And that's why I did want to bring up some of the supply chain disruptions so that you can see the bigger impact, especially for products that are reliant on raw materials. Giving everyone an understanding of how significant the resources are in Ukraine and how other countries are so reliant on those. Now we have to find other sources. It's very similar to, what's happened in China and the disruption and everything that's happening there from the perspective, of COVID-19 and the long delays that have happened. Now we're seeing it on the Russia side, but even more of a bigger impact from a different perspective. Yeah, there's no way to talk, a wily trade lawyer said it really well. He says there is no, how can I walk a tightrope here? The sanctions are only going to increase in severity, which means that the disruptions to your supply chain, the routing and the cargo and the transportation are only going to get worse. So as businesses, we need to look at other sources of where we get products that could have this impact. And again, this goes back to your risk analysis. How reliant are you in exports to this region? How reliant are you on imports coming in, or raw materials, or your customers, your vendors that you source products from, that they rely on products from there? Having that risk assessment to understand how much of an impact is this going to be, and where else can I go to source the products that are needed.
Well, that really brings up, in my mind, certainly another question as it relates to supply chain generally. If you've already got, let's say, commodities that were in the pipeline, as it were, from those sanctioned locations, and it's already in the pipeline, companies have to be able to address supply chain changes. Where do they go to find the new product? But they've got maybe product that's already in the pipeline. We're only talking, what, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? I don't know the extent of all, it's not been a long time. And so there's probably a lot of things that are still in play. Do you have any thoughts on that as it relates to, and commodities in particular, how that might play out with those things that are already sort of in process? Are they just going to have to? Anyway, I'll let you talk to that.
No, you're fine. I mean, really, it goes back to what I said. It's a risk assessment. It's understanding, the raw materials that your vendor. So let's say, for example, you're buying products from a vendor to help you in the production of what you manufacture here. So going all the way back to the titanium, the palladium, anyone that's in the agricultural industry, right? Those products that could be a part of the raw material that are used into your finished product that you're buying, so that you can turn around and maybe do an additional assembly or something to it. Do any of those products that they are a big source for have an impact on your supply chain, which is going to have a disruption to you in trying to sell and export to someone else? That's where your risk assessment comes in, and that's what you need to look at. For some companies, it is an impact. For some, it's not.
Well, just to follow up too, and I certainly don't have your expertise in this, so it's a bit of a naive question, I guess, but that is there visibility with regards to the origin of raw materials in particular in every instance, or are there ways? And I'm not talking about ways of evasion. I'm just talking about where people may not know what kind of vulnerability they have relative to those key commodities. Or is it pretty much assumed that it's going to be something that everybody has an assessment as to where the origin was for a particular raw material, even if it went to a third country, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, can you talk a little bit to that?
So other than research that I've done, just in some of the reports that have already been made, I mentioned earlier about the titanium, the palladium. They're known for their corn and their wheat. Anybody that relies on gas and, which is going to be your EU impact for the natural gas and any of the investments that were made for any type of energy sector, right? That's going to be a huge impact. I would look at the companies that have pulled out of those regions, where you may have partnerships with, if there's, any impact there. To say if there's a list out there, I've not seen it. Doesn't mean there isn't, because I'm not an expert, in everything that comes out of Russia, right, or even the Ukraine area. But it's certainly worth a conversation with your supply chain, which also is, the way the world is leaning to, with the global labor relations on forced labor, right? Companies are now needing to know from their supply chain where raw materials are being sourced from. And so these are good questions that you can work with your suppliers. Do they expect to see an impact on this for any raw material that they source? And it's worth posing a question to your vendors that you buy product from.
That sure sounds like a good strategy. And it seems to me that maybe the first thing, like you say, it's tough to get a handle on what the entire list of vulnerable commodities or raw materials might be. But hey, take a quick look at what's being produced, what's being exported, just like you said, titanium, palladium, et cetera, and then develop that list and see if you have any particular exposure that derives from that particular type of raw material maybe being in your supply chain, either unbeknownst to you or however, but that makes sense. I've got another question relative to China. Certainly China participates in the global economy, the banking system, et cetera, the global trade regimes, but given what, and we don't know a whole lot, certainly, but given the relationship that we believe to be in play between China and Russia at this time, are there any particular thoughts that you have relative to, because China is a major producer of product and inputs. I think I saw a stat where 60% of the imports from China, I think in particular, coming to the United States are for inputs into manufactured products for export or for domestic consumption. And so if you're talking about, again, this supply chain process, is there anything that we have to consider as it relates to China and Russia in that whole backdrop? And again, I'm asking some tough questions because you're the expert. So I'm just kind of curious where your mind goes on this and what you think about it.
That is our number one concern. Companies have to have a contingency plan, because if China partners together with Russia and you source products out of China, wow, you've got to have a contingency plan, because the US will impose sanctions against China. And that's, they're watching that very, very carefully. There's rumors, I'm not an economist by no means. There's lots of rumors out there that China is using it as a negotiating tool. They're not expected to join as partners with them against and I say against the U.S. because the U.S. is working diligently with China, for their export control laws to have something. We've just now gained insight under the Uyghur law that comes effective in June on forced labor, where before we've never been able to gain access into their territory to understand. There's never been any visibility or tracing. So that's another contingent factor that you need to know that's going to have an impact on your supply chain as well. If you source product out of China, the new laws that are coming down on forced labor, you have to know where they're sourcing that raw material from. And so that, like I said, there's no real good answer other than that the government's watching it very, very closely and be prepared for a contingency plan if it happens. And a lot of companies were starting to pull out of China because of the Section 301 tariffs. although some of the exclusions were reinstated. But now with the new forced labor laws and stuff, because they found a loophole in the laws going into effect, that's putting even more contingency and restrictions and things on understanding your suppliers and where their raw materials are sourced from to make sure it's not coming in from a specific region. And of course, with this whole Russia, China situation, yeah, they're very, very closely watching it, Jeff, because there is fear. That is everyone's biggest fear. They will partner together, and China will finance Russia, as Russia's already asked China for it. They haven't said yes yet. So, you know.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, last question for you, and this again is a little bit more sort of speculative, but an informed speculation. I'm not going to put you on the spot with anything that's totally out there. But taking a look at the sanctions that have been put in place thus far, the way the restrictions have happened in the banking community, certainly the transportation. You've talked about airspace. You've talked about all kinds of aspects of constraint or restriction associated with, again, the locations that we're talking about. Are there any other kinds of escalations that could happen in terms of tightening up that haven't been already in play, or are of a different kind, or are they merely going to be degrees of that? I know that the supply of gas and oil, where all the revenues coming in, is a major source of concern relative to how it plays out in terms of financing the war machine, to be sure, out of Russia, but Russia's economy. Do you see what would you see in terms of further kinds of tightening that may occur, and what kind of a time frame might you see that to happen within, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a really great economist question. That's what I'll say. You know, other than placing an embargo on Russia, you know, I mean, BIS has already put controls, and at the end of the slide presentation, there's an annex section where I've given a summary of the regulations and restrictions of what BIS has done and what OFAC has done in the landing law in Russia, just as a reference and stuff. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can see is embargoes. I mean, I don't know how much tighter you can squeeze a sanction, because we've pretty much made as tight as we can. But I can tell you that if a company is found in violation, wow, right now this is so hot that they'll just be front page news on the Wall Street Journal and CNN News. And so you just better make sure that if you are going to continue to do business, you can find a way to get it there, and you can find a way to get paid, and that, you know, the route that it's going to go is not going to cause any hindrance or problems. You're actually going to be able to get it there, if you have to have a license, you know, or not. I mean, because right now a lot of things are a license of denial, and for items that are controlled. So yeah, that's an economist question, Jeff. All I can do is give opinion on that.
Well, again, Lesa, you've got an informed opinion, and certainly you touch upon some of the areas. So we appreciate very much your thoughts on that subject. Yeah, I think the bottom line takeaway here is that the risk is fairly high as one engages in business in these areas. And so do so at your own risk and with plenty of foresight. But it certainly makes sense that people perhaps look at other kinds of alternative pathways, both in terms of input supply as well as export markets, to be sure. Well, with that, I would like to say thank you to all the attendees. We really appreciate having Lesa again give us all of this really well-informed perspective on what's going on. It may be the case, quite honestly, Lesa, and I'll say it here on the recording. You know, this is a rapidly changing circumstance. Maybe it might be in 4, 5, 6 months' time, depending upon the pace of this. We might ask you to come back and kind of give us an update, simply because there are so many different twists and turns that seem to be possible. And we really appreciate all of the informed content that you've given us. So thank you very much, Lesa. And thank you, all the attendees. We look forward to you participating in our next webinar, which will be approximately a month from today. And you'll be able to see announcements of that. Additionally, if you want to review this, as I indicated in my opening statement, the webinar itself will be posted like all the other webinars, including Lesa's really informative supply chain webinar that she helped us out with earlier. All those are available on the Kansas Commerce website. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.